Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of 1920 to 45, and in particular the period of the Roaring Twenties. In this final group of lectures about the 20s, we're going to be talking about the Harlem Renaissance, the flowering of black literature, culture, and art that flourished throughout the 1920s and 30s, focused in Harlem, New York, but spreading all across the country and making its presence felt in towns and cities everywhere in the United States. In this first lecture, we're going to be talking about the origins of the Harlem Renaissance and the conditions that made it possible. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Europeans and Americans were beginning to realize the particular cultural value in African heritage. In the 1890s, the composer Dvorak declared that the slave spirituals were America's first authentic contribution to world culture. A decade later, Pablo Picasso celebrated the African form in many of his works, most notably Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, part of the new art form of Cubism. While controversial, Picasso's painting contributed to a growing fascination with Africa and its people. Artists such as Paul Gauguin and Henri Matisse were also drawn to African art for inspiration. Inspired by such works, others began to explore the history and culture of Africans. This movement ultimately reached America as well. As with so many other cultural aspects of the 1920s, the influence of World War I is enormous when we think about conditions leading to the Harlem Renaissance. First of all, during the war, we had the Great Migration, the movement north of massive numbers of blacks from the south to the north. This disrupted old population patterns and offered hope for change for a number of different reasons. In many cases, it provided economic improvement and education for blacks, and also created greater incentive for opportunities to vote and thus to fight for democracy here at home. The fight for democracy abroad also led to greater expectations at home. This meant the role of African American soldiers in World War I took on heightened importance. Almost 300,000 black soldiers fought in the war. There was still much segregation and racism in the military and the war in general that was experienced by those soldiers. But they also served with Europeans and lived among them, not as outcasts, but accepted as human beings. They were empowered by this military service, came home and demanded respect, spoke out against lynching, segregation, and racism. And as described in previous lectures, lynching and racial violence were still a major problem across much of the country, of course concentrated in the South. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later on. Conditions weren't always easy, of course, for blacks who left the South for the North. There was still a considerable amount of racism and discrimination. In many cases, they struggled to find good jobs or good housing. But for the most part, conditions were better in the North. And there was one key difference between the North and the South, and that is that blacks in the North could vote. This provided them with political mobilization, and gradually, as the number of blacks in the North grew, they became a significant voting bloc that politicians had to be attentive to if they intended to win their elections. And so blacks became a much more significant voice in a number of policies in the North. We even begin to see some black politicians elected during this period. Oscar DePriest of Illinois, for instance, became the first black congressman since Reconstruction. There is also a growing tradition of black intellectualism and leadership, going back to Booker T. Washington in the late 1800s and funneling through W.B. Du Bois in the early 20th century. Du Bois demanded full civil liberties and an end to segregation. In 1909, he helped to establish the NAACP, which fought against segregation in many ways and in particular challenged racist laws in the courts. There were other responses as well. The loudest voice of this period might well have been that of Marcus Garvey. Garvey reached the masses of blacks clustered in such places as Harlem, New York, like no other leader of his time. He preached black nationalism and black pride. "Up, you mighty race! You can accomplish what you will," he said. In 1914, Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, to unite, quote, "all the Negro peoples of the world," and establish a black nation in Africa. Garvey, who was from Jamaica himself, preached a new idea among blacks, that their race and their history was beautiful and glorious and should be celebrated. They need not be a defeated race, but should stand up and make their own fate. He insisted that blacks must develop, quote, "a distinct type of civilization of his own, and work out his salvation in his motherland, all to be accomplished under the stimulus and influence of the slogan, 'Africa for Africans,' at home and abroad." Garvey encouraged blacks to be independent and to support black businesses. The UNIA itself helped to found grocery stores, restaurants, laundries, hotels, and other black businesses. It became a large conglomerate with thousands of investors. The crown jewel of this business was the Black Star steamship line, which was to establish a link between the United States, the West Indies, and Africa. Some 40,000 blacks invested nearly $1 million in the enterprise. Garvey was outspoken, threatening, and considered dangerous by some whites in America at that time, and thus the government set out to try to bring him down. Garvey, at times, would dress in military garb and led parades through the streets. The government struggled to catch him on any illegal activity, and so they focused in on the Black Star steamship line and the way that money had been raised, which was by advertising in the mail and having potential clients and customers send $5 through the mail for their ticket on the Black Star steamship line to Africa. Those tickets were never fulfilled, as the steamship line never really took off. And so eventually, Garvey was arrested for mail fraud. He spent some time in jail and then ultimately was deported to Jamaica as an undesirable alien. Garvey was a prominent black man, and he was silenced by the government under dubious circumstances. And yet his ideas helped to spark a flowering of black pride that found expression in the cultural revival that followed, known as the Harlem Renaissance. The focal point of the Harlem Renaissance was black pride and an interest in African culture. These were ideas that Garvey had focused on very loudly and prominently, and that others who followed him would build upon. In the next lecture, in fact, we'll talk about a few of the writers and intellectuals who followed the tradition of Garvey, leading us into the Harlem Renaissance